Okay, we're going to continue learning. We're continuing the sugya we were last week in middle, which is the question about the sanctification of Yerushalayim, the Beis HaMikdash specifically, if it was sanctified initially, does that sanctification hold true for La'asad Lavi as well for the future, for all times? Let's just bring up the text here. So we're in the Gemara Daf Yud Amud Aleph. Megillah Daf Yud Amud Aleph, middle of the page. We're holding, it says Tanoihi. Now, what is, again, just to go back to the discussion that we had, the discussion that we had was with regard to a statement by Rabbi Yitzchak. The Mishnah says that trying to find the difference between Shiloh and Shiloh, that after the destruction of Shiloh versus after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Mishnah says, "Ein bein Shiloh Yerushalayim." That there's no difference between Shiloh, which hosted the Mishkan for 300 plus years, and Jerusalem. Is that we're number one is where we can eat the certain things that are connected to Yerushalayim. How does that work versus places that we could eat in Shiloh? Meaning, if you have to eat the second tithings or the kachim kalim, which has to be eaten in a certain space, it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim. Whereas Shiloh, as long as you could see the tabernacle, which could be from a distance even further, then it's still okay to eat the second tithings and the kachim kalim. The second statement it says is that the Mishnah continues that also kedusha Shiloh, that the sanctification, when the when the Jewish people sanctified Shiloh to be a city to host the tabernacle, yesh achreha heter, once Shiloh was destroyed, when we said Nov and Givon, that they had what's called the Mizbeach HaGadol, the large altar, which was used to sacrifice the sacrifices for the tzibur. And there's a question about the tzibur as well as the nedavim and nedavais of the donations. That after Shiloh was destroyed, it was permissible to also have bamais pratios, the small personal altars that people had in their own space, and that wasn't connected to Jerusalem or Shiloh, wherever you lived in Eretz Yisrael, seemingly. Whereas Yerushalayim ein achra heter. Our mission says clearly there's no such thing as, once Jerusalem was established as the place for the temple, even after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, first or second, there's no longer an opportunity for someone to have their own private bama, which means there's no such thing as a sacrifice outside of the Temple Mount, not just outside the Temple Mount, outside exactly where the Mizbeach was. Okay, so our mission is quite clear. It's not leaving room for discussion about if a person could do a sacrifice today outside of the Beis HaMikdash, even after the destruction. Comes Rabbi Yitzchak, and he says a statement that today, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, a person could go, if they choose, to sacrifice in the house of Chani, which is then was in Alexandria of Egypt. So it's not it's not in Eretz Yisrael, and B, it's not. So that we had all the discussions that we learned about the question of how could you do outside of Eretz Yisrael? Was it l'shem shemaim? Was it for the Gentiles? What was he doing? So what he was doing at the time of the temple, obviously he wasn't allowed to have the temple of Chani outside of Yerushalayim. The question is, now that this Beis Mikdash is destroyed, could one, in theory, sacrifice in the house of Chani? The house of Chani stood past the Beis HaMikdash. Stood longer than it was destroyed after the destruction of the second temple. Not many years, but it was afterwards. So Rabbi Yitzchak wasn't talking actually, because by the time Rabbi Yitzchak was around this rabbi, there was no such thing as the house of Chani. We're talking about the concept of it. So the question that we have is our Mishnah, and another Mishnah that says that clearly you're not allowed to sacrifice outside of the temple, outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now we have a pasuk that I didn't come, that God says, "Le'basi ela menucha v'lenachla." Menucha, God's resting place is Shiloh. Nachla, my inheritance is Yerushalayim. And the question is it a state of division or of inclusiveness? Meaning to say that we're comparing Jerusalem to Shiloh and Shiloh to Jerusalem. And just like Menucha after Menucha, which is Shiloh, clearly that's not even a question, because after the destruction of Shiloh, by Nov and Givon, they had the opportunity to have private bamas, private altars. So menucha is like, nachla is like menucha, or is it coming to separate that there's menucha and there's nachla, right? I rested here, which is menucha from the word to linoach, to rest, and nachla, my inheritance. I came home. Once I come home, there's no outside, there's no more resting. And even if my home is destroyed, this is my home. I've come to my place. So therefore, Yerushalayim is different than Shiloh, or is it the same as Shiloh? So the conclusion of our mission is clear that Yerushalayim is different than Shiloh. That once God comes to Nachala, there's no such thing as Bamis anymore. There's no such thing as a private altar. And we have another Mishnah that we've asked that says a similar statement. It says, Rami, from when we asked the question, Kashi of Ramori, because he says, there's another Mishnah that says, Mishabar Yerushalayim, that's Rabbamis. That says clearly, doesn't leave room for misunderstanding. Once Jerusalem was established as the city, no more was it permitted to have a private altar. Now the Gemara wants to say about the question, which this is again, seeming how the Gemara continues in the flow from here, which we're holding now, is, are we still discussing Rabbi Yitzchak's question? Or are we having a general question about Yerushalayim? Now we have to remember this. The thing that has to be taken in the context that there's two ways to look at the question. Like we said I think it was in the Tosfos we learned last week that asks, why can we just say that Rabbi Yitzchak holds according to the discussion that we're about to have in the Mishnah? Because there's a discussion. So the answer that the Tosfos gave was that it's possible that once Yerushalayim is, that means now we're going to bring up another question. The question is that did the sanctification that David and Shlomo did in Yerushalayim, David and Shlomo, Shmuel also was planning the Beis HaMikdash, is that the sanctification that they've done in Yerushalayim, was it everlasting or if it was only temporary? If it's everlasting, then there's always a Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim. If it's temporary, so seemingly there's no more significance to Yerushalayim. Or Tosfos says that's not maybe the point. Maybe the point is Yerushalayim stays the city, but Yerushalayim itself has to be sanctified again. Even the Mizbeach itself has to be sanctified. Now we know for sure that the Jewish people sacrifices in Jerusalem for 20 odd years, like Rashi is going to say, for 20 years, from when they came back after the second Aliyah, but before Ezra built the Beis HaMikdash. The second temple was built later, and they built the altar first. So they were sacrificing on Temple Mount without a temple, without an actual physical structure of the temple. So the question is why? So here we come to our Mishnah. Tanois, and where is this question of was Jerusalem sanctified once? The Kedusha, like we said, the question, the Lashon is over here. Kedusha Rishayna Kitcha L'Shaita V'Lei Kitcha L'Asalave. Was it only temporary sanctified, or if it was also for the future? So this question, if it was for the future or not, is a question of a machlekes of Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua, seemingly. Why? Tanai, we could think there's a question of a machlekes of Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua, which were colleagues, and they argued about many things. And this is one of the discussions seemingly they had. They're all students of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai. So it's Rabbi Lezer. Shemaiti, I heard. And you have to remember, it's not that many years before. Rabbi Lezer lived during the time of this, or at least right after the destruction of the Second Temple. You're talking about 500 years. Okay. So Rabbi Lezer said, Shemaita, I heard, when they built the sanctuary on the Second Temple, then they came back as they were getting ready to build the Second Temple. It didn't happen right away. First, Oisim Kloim, they put up like curtains, Lehechel, to the sanctuary, Ukloim Lazara, and they put up curtains for the courtyard of the temple, meaning they marked off the spaces of where hypothetically the temple was going to be built in a future time. So they put up these curtains. The question is, what were the curtains representing? He says, that's what I heard. They put up these curtains. Later, when they built the sanctuary, so they built a heichel outside where those curtains were. So the curtains were inside the walls. And the courtyard, they built inside the courtyard, meaning the curtains were outside the eventual walls that went up. Okay, so Rashi says, at this point in the discussion, were under the impression that why did they put up these curtains? They put it up in place of the walls. These curtains were as if the walls were up. Why? Why do we have to have the walls up? Because we have a pasuk that says Mul Oil Moed, that the altar has to be mul against where the oil moed is, where the sanctuary is. It should be by the door of the oil moed. Because if we don't have the picture, I don't have the picture to bring up right now. If the big altar, which is the altar, it's called Mizbeach HaChutz, was outside the oil moed. The oil moed was in the Mishkan, but in the Beis HaMikdash it was called the Heichel, the sanctuary. Shilmole came because if not for that, they put up the curtains, which created, so to say, the space of the Oyel Moyed or the Heichel, the sanctuary. They would never have put up, they would never be able to sacrifice. Until they finished actually building the temple. Because you have a pasuk that says that the Mizbeach has to be Pesach al Moed. And when did they start sacrificing? Again, this is the second temple. When did they start sacrificing the second temple? Sacrifices when they came back, because there was a few aliyot. They didn't come one time. They has Rubavel who came, right? You have the prophecy of Zechariah of the Kohen Gadol, right? Tzidkiyahu Kohen Gadol. So he was the Kohen Gadol at the time of the prophecy was before the temple was standing. So they started to sacrifice Mishabo Shambi Mekorash when they came before the story of Purim. When Cyrus gave them permission to go back, they started to sacrifice right away. Ukumai Shekasev b'Sefer Ezra, as the book of Ezra clearly says. But Esrim Shana, it took 20 years, and the whole story of Purim is in between. And he put up with Daryavush, Darius, they put up this actual temple. They only put up the temple in the life of Daryavish, the last. Evidently, I think there was 2 or 3. Daryavish was Darius, the son of Esther. And like we learned in Rosh Hashanah, that he was involved in the building of the second temple. And only then did they put up the actual temple. So why did they put up the curtains? So they could have the structure, so to say. The Oyel Moed, that was done by the curtains. So it says that they built outside the curtains. Why? Because what they did was they put the curtains a little inside of the sanctuary space, and they didn't want the workers, which were not Kohanim, to step into the sanctuary. Now, from here, something else. That the fact that the curtains went up made as if the sanctuary was already a sanctuary. And once it's a sanctuary, a regular person can't walk in. They didn't necessarily have this issue when they built the first temple, because they only became a sanctuary after Shlomo dedicated it. But here the curtains made it like a temple. So therefore they had to stand outside the Heichel to build outside the curtains to build the walls. Now, the problem with this, Tosfos is going to say, is that they made the Heichel smaller. Means at the end of the day is the walls where it ends up being the sanctuary. The curtains kind of now made it a little narrow, because if the curtains are on the inside of the wall, so they don't have the complete measurements of the wall of the. So let's see what Rabbi Steinzat says. Rashi says the Gemara seeks to prove from here that according to Rabbi Lezer, the initial consideration sanctifying Jerusalem for its time only and not forever. Meaning, if Rabbi Lezer would hold that the curtains, that the Beis HaMikdash was Kitcha B'Shaita and Kitcha La'Salavi, that when they sanctified it, David and Shlomo, in the first temple, it was always sanctified. So that's anyways the place of the Oyel Moed. So they would just have to put up a Mizbeach, and that's fine. There's no need for the curtains. The curtains are only to create the Oyel Moed, the Heichel. Again, the Heichel and Oyel Moed are the same thing. The Oyel Moed is what it was called in the tabernacle, and the Heichel what is called in the Beis HaMikdash. It's the sanctuary. So we have the sanctuary, and the inner sanctuary is the Holy of Holies, right? So in the temple, that was the Heichel. That's the structure that we see in the pictures of the Beis HaMikdash. And in the Mishkan, that is the place that has the beams with the coverings of the skins. That's all. That's the Ohel Moed, and this is the Heichel, but it serves as the same purpose. where they housed the inner altar with the candelabra and the table, and inside is the Holy of Holies where the ark is. Okay, so the only reason they have to put up the curtains to make the heichel is because there was no heichel, because the kedusha left, and you can't do the mizbeach if there's no heichel, there's no oil moed. So he says, Rashi says that he holds that initial consecration and sanctification in Jerusalem at the time only and not forever. Consequently, hangings were necessary to establish barriers around the temple in order to sanctify it. So the actual hangings of these curtains was to create the sanctification of the space. The hangings were later replaced with walls. Others seek to prove from the statement of Rabbi Lezer that he maintained that the initial consecration sanctified Jerusalem forever, as otherwise, when they established the hangings, they minimized the area of the sanctuary. Okay, I'm not sure how this works in the Gemara that we're learning. Basically, what he's quoting over here is that, on the contrary, that Rabbi Lezer, the very fact that they put the curtains inwards, I think, because they only built the walls outside the curtains, if he was sanctifying it with the curtains, he was sanctifying less space, because the curtains are inside the walls, even if it's a few feet, but you lose the footage all on the outside parameter of where the wall was. So by making the curtains inside, they didn't do the proper measurement of the Beis HaMikdash. And it's prohibited to change the measurements. Therefore, it must be that the hangings were established for seclusion, just for privacy. But that's the end of our answers. I'm not sure what this Yarot is alluding to. The Meiri concurs with the first opinion, citing proof from the Tractate Chagiga, while Rabbeinu Tam rejects proof. Okay, so there's a question. If even initially there's any thought to say that the curtains could have been a form of sanctification. That's the question. Okay, so Amar Rabbi Yeshua says, that's our opinion of Rabbi Lezer. Rabbi Lezer says, I heard that they put curtains, and this we want to prove. That's what, I mean, I'm not sure, again, what the Yosdavash is saying. I think that when he says the Rabbeinu Tam, maybe he means about the Rabbeinu Tam talk about the Makom HaMizbeach. But just the basic understanding of the Talmud at this point is that the very fact that Rabbi Lezer said they put up the curtains means that the sanctification of David and Shlomo did not last in the second temple. Once it was destroyed, there was no sanctification, and they required the curtains to sanctify the space so they could have it, like Rashi says, Pesach HaMoed, to put up the Mizbeach in its right place opposite the sanctuary, at the door of the sanctuary. Rabbi Shur says no. You could sacrifice even if there's no home. You could eat the holy sanctified sacrifices. Even if there's no curtains to guard off that space. Which is the space of the Azara, of the courtyard. You could eat the more lesser sanctified sacrifices that are able to be eaten in the city of Jerusalem. The second tithings, like we learned in the Mishnah, has to be eaten in the city of Jerusalem, even if there's no wall of the city of Jerusalem. Because Rabbi Shua says it's not necessary. When David and Shlomo sanctified the space, it was sanctified forever, and therefore the Makam HaMikdash is the Makam HaMikdash, where the Azara is, where the courtyard is, that's where you could eat the sanctified sacrifices. Where the walls of Jerusalem are supposed to be is where you could eat the lesser sanctified sacrifices and the second tithings. And you could sacrifice it on top of the Mizbeach. And therefore there's no necessity for the curtains. The curtains, it means he's arguing seemingly. With Rabbi Elazar, it says that Rabbi Elazar holds you needed the curtains to sanctify, to create the space of the Mikdash. It's not necessary because David and Shlomo did it once. And once they did it once, you don't need to do it again. From here, the Gemara says, again, this is not necessarily a continuation of the subject of the house of Chani. Like Tosfos says, you could either learn that this is trying to, because we already learned last week that Rabbi Yitzchak said, he walked back a statement. He said, I never said it, or if he said it, I never mean it, or I regret saying it. Why? Because there's clear missions that say that once Jerusalem was established, you cannot sacrifice out Jerusalem. And Tosfos says the question could only be, the argument of Rabbi Elazar would be that if not for the curtains, you wouldn't be able to do that. And it seems like Rashi agrees, that if not for the curtains, you wouldn't be able to sacrifice on the altar, because you need the oil moyed. But it means it's not a question of you're able to sacrifice anywhere. You're not allowed to sacrifice. You're not allowed to sacrifice anywhere. It means not that you could do it anywhere. You can't do it anywhere, not even in the temple, unless you have because there's no sanctification. And Jerusalem, once it was established, you could only do it in Jerusalem, and it has to be sanctified first. Which means that based on where we're holding now in the Gemara, today, if someone were to go to Temple Mount and find the exact space where the Mizbeach is, it's possible you still can't sacrifice because there's no Kedusha, it still has to be sanctified. But the Gemara says no. So the Gemara says maybe that's the argument. There was no sanctification, therefore they needed the curtain. And therefore it's not still a proof to Rabbi Yitzchak because Rabbi Yitzchak wants to sacrifice in Alexandria of Egypt. That's not possible because it's Shechita and still Jerusalem, but you can't even sacrifice possibly according to Tosfos, according to Rabbi Chanan of Tosfos. Can't sacrifice even on Temple Mount until you do a sanctification. So Rashi says, the fact that Rabbi Lezer holds that you have the curtain, Savri holds, like Kichel Achurban, that after this destruction, there's no more sanctification, and without the sanctification, you can't sacrifice, even on Temple Mount, even on the space of the Mizbeach. Seemingly, Rashi agrees with Tosfos. The Fikach Pirsu Kloim, therefore, they put up the curtains, B'mokim Binyan, instead of the building, because they couldn't afford, or they weren't ready yet to put up the building. V'chodzru v'kitshu, and through the curtains they sanctified it. B'toidais to b'shir, with sacrifices of thanks and with music of the Levites. They did a ceremony. It wasn't just they pegged in curtains and went weiter. They had some sort of ceremony. He quotes the Gemara Shvuos, and that ceremony was the sanctification of the second space of the temple. Okay, Tosfos Reb Shein Zat says like this: with regard to this matter, there is a fundamental dispute cited by Tosfos and others, other early authorities here, and it apparently also relates to the dispute between the Rambam and the Ravid. Again, this is a deep argument of a discussion again of the Rabbi Stilterik. He says the Rambam Ravid about the sanctification of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Again, there's also a question if we're talking about a sanctification of Jerusalem or a sanctification of Temple Mount. This could be two different questions. So Rambam and Ravid, with regard to the sanctity of the temple, based on the Gemara here, there appears to be a question. Was the sanctity of the land abrogated by the destruction of the second temple? It means once the second temple was destroyed, is there no more sanctification? Possibly not of Eretz Yisrael, and not of Yerushalayim, not of Temple Mount. If it was, then the sanctity of Jerusalem was similarly abrogated, meaning to say, just like Eretz Yisrael is no longer holy, separate, so too Jerusalem is not separate. However, in the opinion of the Rambam and many others, the sanctity of Jerusalem, in terms of the prohibition against sacrificing offerings elsewhere, and the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael are not interdependent. The Rambam holds two different questions. Is there a Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael is one question. Is Eretz Yisrael holy is one question. Meaning to say, do we have biblical obligations today to give tithings and all the other questions about the sanctification of Eretz Yisrael? That's not just a question of how holy it is, but what are the laws of Meiser, Truma, Shvius, sabbatical, all the questions that we have. Is Yerushalayim lost its Kedusha according to the biblical, or is it only rabbinic, etc.? But according to the Rambam, that's that question about Eretz Yisrael. It has nothing to do with Jerusalem. Jerusalem is still sanctified. The sanctity of Jerusalem and the temple was never abrogated. It always stayed. The Kedusha always stayed. Although the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael was. See, the Rashba also discusses this at length. Others write that Rabbi Yitzchak structured his opinion due to the same considerations. Initially, he maintained that there was only one dispute here, basing his opinion on those who said that the sanctity of the land was abrogated, and therefore, once Eretz Yisrael wasn't holy, so too Yerushalayim wasn't holy. If Yerushalayim is not holy, then I could sacrifice in Alexandria of Egypt. Again, he's not talking a crazy concept, because Bo Nagid, even if you want to say that the house of Chani was it's not a house of Avodah Zarah, that's clear. But if you want to say if they sacrificed for Gentiles, for the Bnei Noach, or they sacrificed for Jews, but the idea that they sacrificed outside of Eretz Yisrael happened, because all the years, the 40 years in the desert, they were sacrificing outside of Eretz Yisrael. When did Eretz Yisrael become a Makoim? When they sanctified Eretz Yisrael, when they captured Eretz Yisrael with Joshua. Eretz Yisrael became the place, and then Yerushalayim became the Nachala when David captured Jerusalem. And then they sanctified Temple Mount with David and Solomon. And so according to Rabbi Yitzchak, he thought that it's one sanctity, And once Israel lost its sanctity, so too Jerusalem lost its sanctity, and therefore he said, why can't I sacrifice in the house of Chani? However, once he realized that the sanctity of Jerusalem was and the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael are not interdependent, it's possible that Eretz Yisrael no longer has its kedusha, but Yerushalayim still has its kedusha, and that there's no one that holds that the sanctity of Jerusalem is abrogated. He retracted his opinion. So that now explains, according to Sfas Emes, why Rabbi Yitzchak retracted. It means even though there's a machlokes between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua, if they had to sanctify Yerushalayim, but it could be if the Temple Mount, but we're going to see that it's not an argument, because even according to this footnote should have been a little later after the end of the Gemara. But basically, in the question that we have is, Yerushalayim definitely has some sort of sanctity. Even according to Rabbi Lezer, according to Tosfos, there was never a question if you could sacrifice outside Yerushalayim. The question is if you could sacrifice in Yerushalayim. But Rabbi Yitzchak, when he realized that it's possible that the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is no longer there on the level it was, but that doesn't affect Yerushalayim, and everyone agrees Yerushalayim remained sanctified. Therefore, there's not a possibility to sacrifice in the house of Chani even after the destruction of the temple. So he says, this is the opinion of Rabbi Shua. He says it's permitted to sacrifice all offerings, even although the temple is not standing. The offerings of the most sacred order may be eaten in the entire courtyard, even though the walls are destroyed. Means even if you go up today, tonight's Tisha B'Av, unfortunately, if Mashiach doesn't come, so we're going to be mourning the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So there's a big question if you could go up to Har Bayis. There's a big, obviously, question about today going up to Har Bayis. What is the sanctity today of Har Bayis? So obviously it's this place of sanctity. The question is where, if you could walk up on the Temple Mount today, if you can, it's a whole discussion. But tomorrow, a lot of people go up to this Beis HaMikdash, to the Temple Mount. So he says that doesn't make a difference if the walls are not the walls of the temple. According to Rabbi Yeshua, the Azara is the Azara. And if you were if in theory one went to the Mizmakim Mizbeach today, according to Rabbi Yeshua, made a sacrifice, they have to eat it in the space of where the Azara is in the times of the temple. And if you go up on the Temple Mount, that is the Azara. And therefore it's a big question, can you go up on Temple Mount today? Because that's the Azara, that's the courtyard. And it's not so simple for a person who's tamei to go in the courtyard. We don't have the waters of the red heifer. Second tithings and the offerings of lesser sanctity may be eaten throughout Jerusalem. He's quoting Rabbi Shua, even if the walls are no standing. So today, again, what are the walls of Jerusalem is another question. Anyone who's been to the old city of Yerushalayim, I think Shuki, you spent a year there, knows that in the middle of the Jewish quarter, there's still the remaining of the walls of the city of Yerushalayim. What we have today, forget the new city of Yerushalayim. We're not talking about what's called where I'm sitting right now on Ben Yehuda. That was never part of Jerusalem. But even today, if you walk into Yafo Gate, from Yafo Gate until mid the Jewish quarter, wasn't the Jerusalem of the times of David and Shlomo. Possibly it was the Jerusalem of the second temple, but it's surely not the Jerusalem of the first temple. So the question is when Ezra, and this is we learned the halachas in Sanhedrin, to expand the borders of Yerushalayim, you have to have the Sanhedrin. So you have to assume that Ezra, if we want to say that today's walled old city is the space of the second temple's walled city, we have to assume that Ezra sanctified up to that space. So he says, Jerusalem, even if the walls are not standing, because the initial consecrations sanctified Jerusalem for its time and forever, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. So the Rambam takes the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua. And he holds it in Sefer Avoda, Hilchas Pesach, HaBechira 6:15. One's supposed to learn the laws of Rambam before Tisha B'Av, so we're learning now the laws of Rambam, which says that the laws according to Rabbi Yeshua, that the sanctity of Jerusalem, the sanctity of the Temple Mount does not require the walls. Now, again, you could broaden the borders of Yerushalayim. We've learned that, right? The whole question of the Zakin Mamre, right? Where's the Zakin Mamre and where's he meet them? So we know that with a Sanhedrin and a majority and all that, so you could have you could expand the boundaries of Yerushalayim. They would go to the point that they wanted to do it, They do sacrifices over. They would do some sort of ceremony. So there's a way of expanding the walls of Yerushalayim. So we have to assume that in the times of Ezra, if Ezra didn't wall off Jerusalem like they did in the first temple, or if later at some point between Ezra and the destruction of the second temple, it's 400 years, Herod, whoever it was, but they did it, the Sanhedrin broadened the borders, so then that becomes the borders of Yerushalayim. So it could be that today's walled city is the borders of the old city of Jerusalem in the second temple, but surely it was not the same boundaries of David and Shlomo. Which means to say, when we say that it was kutra la'asid lavei, that it was always sanctified, doesn't mean that only that space, because halachically you could expand that space. But that Jerusalem becomes the city was a sanctification by David and Shlomo, according to Rabbi Shua, and that's the opinion of the Rambam. Amalei Ravina Avashi. So Ravina says to Ravashi, Mimai, who said that's the argument? Who said the argument to Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua is if the sanctification of Yerushalayim was only temporary until the destruction of the first temple, and therefore, according to Rabbi Lezer, they had to put up the curtains in the time of the second temple to create the sanctity of the temple. Maybe everyone agrees with everyone agrees that when they sanctified Jerusalem, it was forever. Jerusalem is a place of holiness forever. Yes, you could expand the borders, like I said, because the first temple was a different boundary of Jerusalem. But the sanctification, the core sanctification is always. What's the difference between Rabbi Lezer and Yeshua if they had the curtains or not? That they had different opinions of what happened. One, according to Rabbi Lezer, there was curtains. According to Rabbi Yeshua, you never heard about the curtains. So why do they have the curtains if there's no requirement of sanctification? So why do they have the curtains if they were sanctified? Why do they have to put up the curtains? It's just for privacy. It wasn't sometimes we get all caught up. There's a famous story that when the Alter Rebbe was arrested, so he had to go meet afterwards. One of the conditions was he had to go meet 3 rabbis of the non-Hasidic camp. So one of them asked him about the behavior of the Alter Rebbe. He questioned 3 things. He questioned why does he ride a wagon with 4 horses, and why does he eat? Why does he wear silk outer garments, and why does he eat chicken versus meat? So they thought there's some old mystical questions. So he said he rides a wagon of 4 horses because it's quicker. He eats chicken because it's lighter. And he wears silk because it's lighter. So, not every time you see something is there a deep meaning. They had the curtains not because they were sanctifying the temple, but because they wanted privacy, right? You don't have to sit there and sacrifice in front of everyone. So they put up the curtains for privacy, but not because they put up the curtains as a requirement to create the space of the temple, because it's not necessary, because Rabbi Lezer agrees with Rabbi Yeshua that it was always sanctified. Meaning to say, based on this answer of Ravina to Ravashi, there's no longer a question. There's no argument. Everyone agrees that Jerusalem was always sanctified, which means for sure Rabbi Yitzchak would have to walk back his statement and say, today you cannot sacrifice in the house of Chani in Alexandria of Egypt. So Rashi says, not because of sanctification, but just because of privacy. And this Tosfos is a long Tosfos. He brings many different questions of the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. So this, for instance, he brings the question. We know it's a sad story. It's a Gemara actually in Chagiga. It's a Mishnah that's brought down the story of Rebbe Lezer, the same Rebbe Lezer that we're talking about before, was eventually excommunicated. He died in excommunication. He was stubborn with his opinions, and so when he was excommunicated, all his students held by the excommunication, they loved their teacher, but they couldn't go in within 4 spaces of him because there's the laws of excommunication. And he was in Lud, so he wasn't in the yeshiva. So he would always ask, what are they talking about in the yeshiva? And later, before he passed away, when he got sick, they came to see him. Rabbi Kiva, his student Rabbi Kiva, came to see him. And he gave a prophecy of everyone's end, including how Rabbi Kiva is going to die, which wasn't obviously, he was murdered by the Romans. So there's a Mishnah that says a story like this. We'll just bring it up a little bit and go further. The Mishnah says, I think this is it. Yeah. So the Mishnah is a Mishnah in Yahim. if my computer responds properly. Let's see if I could bring it up. If not, we're just going to continue. The discussion like this. This is Bo Bayom. They had a discussion about different things. So Bo Bayom, on that day, this is the day that what's Bo Bayom? Bo Bayom is that, again, things were, you have to remember, in temple times, and we're getting ready for Tisha B'Av, temple times, there was, destruction of the temple, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saved the Sanhedrin, they moved to Yavna. And they had Rabbi Gamliel was reestablished as the Nasi because he was from the house of Hillel. But Rabbi Gamliel was also extremely opinionated and very harsh with his opinion. So he forced his opinion on Rabbi Yeshua. And he was demoted. They said, they demoted him from Nasi, and they appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Boy B'yom, on the day Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became Nasi, they passed many laws. This is in the destruction, in the craziness, in the Shema, the Romans, but the yeshivas were still rocking and rolling. So Boy B'yom, and they passed a lot of laws. One of the questions they had was about Ammon and Moav, Mahim B'Shvius. So this is the question that we're talking about here. When we talk about Eretz Yisrael for sanctification, so we have the laws of tithings. When there's the laws of the sabbatical. When you have the laws of the sabbatical, so there's no requirement for tithings. But if the question is that they wanted to again, in poor times, the downside till today, you have to remember, anyone who lives in Eretz Yisrael or lived in Eretz Yisrael knows that when it comes to the sabbatical, it becomes very hectic here, because there's a fundamental question which really affected when the Netziv, when they came up and the Chov Zion came and to Eretz Yisrael, this is before the state and before Herzl and before Zionism, the Chov Zion came. He was sponsored by, of course, Baron Rothschild, and he put up all the, the Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov, and he fed them with agriculture. He built all these farms and the wineries and all that. So when they came the first sabbatical, they said, "Sorry, we can't work the land, Eretz Yisrael." So that's when there was a huge divide within the Chovevei Tzion, within the Aliyah. The Netziv was against the question of the Heter Mechira. How do you deal with Shvius, with sabbatical? And that question is a question till today, 100 years going plus. So they had a question then also, because what was the whole question in the time of the Chovevei? The people were starving. If they keep the sabbatical, people are going to starve. So they came up with the Heter Mechira. They figured out a way to kind of loophole through the sabbatical. And that loophole is used till today, and that's the argument itself. Is the loophole still applicable? Will they pass the law for the loophole today, based on today's Israel's success, and we're not holding the same situation? But that same situation was then in the time of the destruction of the temple. They needed to, if they stopped tithings, especially the tithings of the poor, people wouldn't have what to eat. So they had a question. Ammon and Moav, today the east side of the Jordan River. Mahim B'Shvius. What's the laws of the sabbatical when it comes to these places that are on the east side of the river? Now, according to most opinions, we're not talking about Bnei Reuven and Bnei Gad, the part of Moav and Ammon that was captured by Sichon, that was kind of what we'd say from the Jordan River north towards the Golan Heights, which was the 2.5 tribes that we learned about in Matas and Masei and the Devarim. But we're talking about the south part of Jordan, south of on the Jordan River, but south. So the Ammon Moav as it really was. So Mahim B'Shvius, what do they have in the laws of Shvius? So Gazer Reb Tarfon Meiser Ani. Reb Tarfon says we have to have the poor man's tithing. So why? Even though it's sabbatical, there's no tithings, but this is not Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, they said if you live in Ammon and Moav, you should give second tithings so the poor people could cross the river and they could get second tithing. A poor man's tithings. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Ma'aseh Sheni, said no, it's not Eretz Yisrael. Then you have to give second tithings, which means you have to go to Yerushalayim to eat it. Rabbi Shmuel Elazar ben Azariah lecha ra'yi l'lamed she'ata machmir. You're being strict. You're making people take their fruits to Jerusalem. Shkol machmir alav ra'yi l'lamed. Prove. If you're being strict, you have to bring proof to being strict. My brother, I go according to the order. We have to have how many years are second tithings and how many years are the poor man's tithings, because you don't give both. You always have to give the first tithings. That's to the Kohen and the Levite. get the Truma Meiser. But the second tithings, some years the fruits went up to Jerusalem for the owner, and some years the fruits went to the poor. So he's saying, I'm going according to the order. Tarfon is changing the order to give it to the poor people. He has to bring a proof. It says Egypt also is not Eretz Yisrael. And just like Egypt, there were second tithings in the sabbatical, so too Ammon and Moav has to give second tithings. Ma Mitzrayim Meiser Ani b'Shvius, Af Ammon and Moav Meiser Ani b'Shvius. Heishiv Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Bava Chutz La'aretz, Ammon and Moav Chutz La'aretz. Ma Bava Meiser Ani b'Shvius, Af Ammon and Moav Meiser Shvius. So they had an argument. Do we compare the southeast of the Jordan River, of Jordan today along the river? Is it like Babylonia or is it like Egypt? So do we have to give second tithings? We have to give poor man's tithings. So they go back and forth. What happens? Come to conclusion. Boy Bayom, they concluded. What did they say? What was the conclusion? Why? What's the reason? So the poor people should have what to eat. What was the conclusion? They came to conclusion, of course. So it says, Nimnu v'in Gomru. The conclusion was, they went with Rabbi Tarfon over Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that in the southeast part of the Jordan River, which is Ammon and Moav, which again was not part of the land of Gad and Ruvain, has to give poor man's tithing, so the poor people have to eat what to eat on Shvius. Again, so from here we see there's a basis to be concerned for the poor on the sabbatical. Okay, what does that have to do with us? Because Shabar Rabbi Yossi ben Durmaskis, ate Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Yossi, the son of Durmaskis, came to visit his Rebbe. Rabbi Elazar wasn't in the yeshiva. Why? Because he was excommunicated. Belod, he's in Lud. What did you guys discuss today in the Beis Medrash, in the yeshiva? After a long discussion, it was concluded that the Ammon and Moav, the lands of Ammon and Moav, which is the southeast side of the Jordan River, on the sabbatical, they have to give second tithings. Poor man's tithings. Bachar Rabbi Elazar cried, he said, Sorry Hashem l're'ev Save Ermelam, that he started to cry. He said that God gives his wisdom to those who are closest to him. Sorry Hashem l're'ev. Why? Tell them, Al tachish l'minanchem. Don't be concerned about your discussions. Why? Mikubal anim Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, because I already have a tradition from all our teachers. The Patish Haggadah, the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Sheshama mi Rabbi v'Ramei b'Rabbi, he all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, Allah adalach l'Moshe misinai, that Ammon and Moav, Meiser and B'Shvius, they were right. That the conclusion that he had with the argument of Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah with the second tithings, or poor man's tithings, all the way from Moshe Rabbeinu, which Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't really discussing such a subject, but he said that in theory, such a subject, if the Jewish people ever lived in Ammon and Moav, because that's again the part that wasn't given to Reuven and Gad, then if someone lives there, they have to give the poor man's tithings in the sabbatical. So therefore, the rabbis came to the right conclusion. Tosfos quotes this Mishnah, because this Mishnah is brought down again later in Chagiga, and the story actually ends up. This is the story in the Mishnah, but the story ends up. What happened is that he cursed. Rabbi Elazar cursed Rabbi Yossi. He says, Amar lo, in the Gemara it says, Pshait yadcha v'kibel anecha, like catch your eyes. He cursed him with blindness. We're not sure why he cursed him with blindness. Some people say he cursed him with blindness because he shouldn't have even quoted a halach in front of his Rebbe. At the end, he davened for him. He got back his vision. And he says, then he quotes, the Gemara quotes again this Mishnah Bachar Rabbi Yossi, and he says that I got from Yochanan ben Zakkai to Moshe Rabbeinu. So he says, why? Now the Gemara says, Matam, why is that Ammon and Moav is poor man's tithings? Because he says, Harba Krachim Kivshim Oilim Mitzrayim. When the people came from Egypt, meaning with Joshua, he captured many villages. All the places that were captured by Joshua were captured by the second Aliyah when they came with Ezra. They didn't capture all the borders of Eretz Yisrael. And the Rambam quotes this. Rabbi Eliezer says that when they sanctified Eretz Yisrael, they only sanctified it the first time with Joshua, it lost its sanctity. And because it lost its sanctity, the questions of tithings and sabbatical don't apply to the borders of Joshua's Israel, Eretz Yisrael, but applies, or the expansion of David. But whatever they captured in the second time they came, if they didn't capture certain places and reestablish it, it's not Eretz Yisrael anymore. And why did they leave certain places? So they shouldn't have to have the laws of sabbatical. Because if they had laws of sabbatical, no one would have what to eat. So they left certain places uncaptured, because then you don't have to keep the laws of sabbatical, and you could keep, and you could give second tithings to the tithings to the poor. And then it says over there, he calmed down. He said he was able to have his vision. Tosfos quotes this whole Gemara. From here we see, in our Gemara, we said a question that we said that Ravina said to Rabashi, that Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol agrees that it was sanctified forever. And we have a clear Mishnah in Yadayim and a Gemara that explains in the Chagiga that Rabbi Eliezer says that the reason that the cities that weren't recaptured in the second Aliyah didn't have the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. So much so that you didn't have to keep the laws of the sabbatical and you had to give tithings to the poor. So how do we say that everyone agrees that Eretz Yisrael had its sanctification forever? So from here, Tosfos concludes that there's a difference between the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael and the sanctity of Yerushalayim. The question about Yerushalayim is never a challenge. Everyone agrees Yerushalayim remained and was sanctified always, but Eretz Yisrael not so. And the Rambam and the laws of Yad HaChazaka, he goes through the taka that the question is today. The question is today. Do we go after the borders of Eretz Yisrael, of Yeshua, or do we go after the borders of the second Aliyah? Means if you have to know what's Eretz Yisrael today, is it the Eretz Yisrael of what Joshua conquered, or is it the Eretz Yisrael that the Jewish people conquered in the second Aliyah? And it's complicated. That's where some places Trumas and Maestris are Safek, certain places Aku and Chsiv. Rambam goes into all the borders that were the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah. And seemingly the halacha is that the first Aliyah lost its sanctity, like Rebbe Eliezer says, and there's a different question. There's also a question of how they conquered it. Chazaka versus Kivush. Through Joshua, they conquered it through capturing. Through Eretz Yisrael was Chizuk. It seems like there was the bottom line is that the second Aliyah was more powerful than the first Aliyah. That's the conclusion that it comes to. That the second Aliyah, whatever was Eretz Yisrael in the second temple, is more Eretz Yisrael today. It's still Eretz Yisrael today, even though we have the Gullus. We're not talking about 1948, the 67 or 48 boundaries. We're talking about Eretz Yisrael from the first temple, second temple. That remains more sanctified than what was captured by Yeshua. Because as far as Eretz Yisrael goes, what was captured by Yeshua lost its sanctity. Recaptured by the second temple, or made a chazak in the second temple, became sanctified. And that sanctification of the second temple seemingly does remain. Okay, sorry, I didn't want to do the whole thing inside. It's complicated. But there's basically also Tosfos says that this discussion of, like I said, Ammon and Moab in the story of Rebbe Eliezer is only talking about the south part of Ammon and Moab. You have to remember something. The Jewish people were not allowed to capture the cities of Ammon and Moab. Ammon and Moab were lands that were given to the children of Lot. Anyone who learned last week's Devarim, Moshe repeats it over and over again. The Jewish people were not given the lands of Ammon and Moab. That was part of Lot. What happened was Sichon was what's called Tiar. He purified some of the lands. When Sichon, the king of Ammon, took over parts of Ammon and Moab, so no longer was Ammon and Moab. He took it away from Lot, and therefore the Jews took it away from him. So those parts the Jews were able to live in. That's where Gad and Ruvain lived. But the south parts of Ammon and Moab, that stayed Chutz La'aretz and was never holy. But so it means to say that till today, there's Eretz Yisrael, there's the east side of the river, but there's the east side of the river where Reuven and Gad lived, and there's the east side of the river where Reuven and Gad didn't live. So the south part is Ammon and Moab proper, and the north part is Ammon and Moab that was tahor, that was cleansed, so to say, by Sichon, and therefore was captured by the 2.5 tribes, and therefore became part of Eretz Yisrael, like he says over in the Tosfos, that Sholosh Artzos, that there's 3 lands, and one of the lands is Evar. Okay, let's go back. So let's try to finish to the Mishnah, to the next subject. So we don't have proof at the end of the day. Again, according to, we have a discussion about Eretz Yisrael. There's seemingly no discussion about Jerusalem. And therefore, again, according to the Sfas Emes, which makes it so nice, that's why Rabbi Yitzchak walked back his statement, because once he realized that there was never a discussion about the Yerushalayim, the discussion is about Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael, there is a discussion if the Kedusha remained, but not about Yerushalayim. So is there still a discussion about Yerushalayim? El Kahai Tanoi, there is a discussion. The Tanya we learned. Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Yossi, says that Lama Monach Chachamas Elu, we're talking about that we found about cities that have walled cities. And the walled cities have different laws. There's different laws of walled cities about what's considered a sale of a walled city. Properties that are in a walled city has different laws. Properties of an unwalled city. And then there's other questions of the Mitzorah. And so the walled cities have a significance in halacha, not just about the Megillah. So Shiksha'alu b'nei Agoyla, when the people came up in the second aliyah from Bavel. Bnei Agoyla means coming from Bavel back to Eretz Yisrael before the rebuilding of the second temple. Matzuas Elu v'kichum, they found certain walled cities and sanctified them as walled cities. Aval Rishonis, but the initial walled cities from the first arrival with Joshua, Batlu Mishabat La'aretz, when the land was destroyed, those cities no longer held the significance of a walled city. From here we see clearly that only the walled cities that they found and they sanctified it were considered walled cities. But the cities that were not walled, even though they were walled in the times of Joshua, lost their sanctification. The question is, that's why it gets a little complicated about the Megillah. There were other cities that they found, that they had in the first temple, or when they came with Joshua. From here we see that clearly it doesn't make a difference, because the walled cities that were in Joshua are not significant. It only becomes significant what they sanctified in the second arrival, in the second aliyah. It's called the aliyah of the Bnei Agola. When we have a question about walled cities, they only mention 9. That they only sanctified 9 of the cities that were sanctified from Joshua's times. So Gemara says, how could you say that? We have a challenge to this statement, because we have another statement of Rabbi Yisrael ben Rabbi Yossi. We'll get to the fact that it's the same person twice. With only these cities. We talk about all the walled cities in the Bashan, in the area of the Golan that they captured. They had many walled cities. Because when they came back, they sanctified these, but there were others as well. For Aminu Maskan de Milsi, the Amr Liel Haitanai Pligi Bikicha Vlekicha. Pligi Bikicha Vlekicha. The question about what was sanctified and what wasn't sanctified. Hold on a second. Hold on one second. See something here. So the question is, seemingly this is not a contradiction yet. Let's just put why did they have to sanctify them? So first he says like this. First statement is Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yossi says that they only counted the cities that they found and they sanctified them because the sanctification lost after the destruction. Then we have seemingly a replica statement. Rabbi Yishmael says they came up and they sanctified. Why did that when they came up they only found these and they sanctified them? But the question is, he continues, Kitchum, why did they have to sanctify them? Because they were sanctified by the times of Joshua. You don't have to sanctify twice. But let's just see Tosfos first. My maisi harch braisid loy mucha ella de kedusha yishayin loy batla veika tanoi the kutcher yishayin v'shnia yeshla hashlishis ein la the kedusha achroni loy batla the kedusha achoni v'hais la'achik kedusha shlishis. The question is like this. He's bringing up the like I said, Tosfos agrees to this also. Even according to the opinions of the first temple, that the first temple lost its sanctity, the second temple kept the sanctity even after the destruction. As he says. The Gemara in Yevamah says that Kucha Rishon Vishnia Yeshla, there's 2 times they had to sanctify, Shlishis Einla, the Kedushas Achroin Leibatla. Even according to the opinion that you needed to sanctify after the first temple, we don't have to sanctify after the second temple, because the second temple sanctification remains even after the destruction. The Kedushas Chonyev Hois Kedushas Shlishis. He's saying basically, so how could you say Chanya you could sacrifice? In Egypt, Eretz Yisrael, according to all opinions, was sanctified after the second Aliyah, and that stayed forever. Everyone agrees that today Eretz Yisrael is holy. Maybe it lost its holiness after Joshua, but everyone agrees it retained its holiness, like the Rambam says in Yat Chazaka. So the answer is that it doesn't mean for everything. Could be it only means for tithings, but for sacrifice, it could be you could sacrifice in the house of Chanya. So let's continue the Gemara. The Gemara says, why is this an argument? So far it seems like it's just a replica. So the Gemara continues, what does he say? You don't have to sanctify them. Because once they were sanctified with Joshua, these walled cities, they don't have to be sanctified a second time. So why did they have to sanctify them? It says they didn't sanctify them. They're just mentioning the ones they found. Not all of them were still there. He says, Amrei, B'Seifa, the Masnisin Gufad, Leitzrichel Kedusha, the Kamasayim Vazil. As long as you have a tradition that these were the walled cities, they are the walled cities. So they're just saying these are the ones that they knew of. As long as you know that there was once a city here, then it's considered a walled city. So here we see clearly that there's 2 opinions in the same person, Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yossi, if the sanctification was forever or not. So we see there's 2 opinions. One opinion is they had to sanctify the walled cities the second time. Another one is you didn't have to sanctify the walled cities the second time. So the Gemara first says Kasher Rabbi Shmuel. It's a contradiction. It's the same person. How could you have the same person say 2 opinions? It's called mitzvah salalu. What are all the mitzvahs? He says, a mitzvah has to be out of a walled city. So as long as you know this was once a walled city, in the times of Joshua, they can't be in that city. Kriyas Megillah. Again, till today, where do we read the Megillah? On the 15th. Anywhere we know was a city in the times of Joshua. And that you read it on the 15th. And also the different laws of selling a house of a walled city versus selling a house of an unwalled city. There's different laws in the Torah. So the Gemara answers straight to Rabbi Shmuel. The 2 opinions of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yossi. Means they're arguing about what he said. Another answer is it's a mistake. It's not Rabbi Shmuel by Rabbi Yossi, it's Rabbi Lazar by Rabbi Yossi, his brother. The Tanya Omer Rabbi Lazar by Rabbi Yossi Omer Asher loy chama, it says loy vav with an aleph. Even though now you can say it means the word loy is either loy vav means to him, or to it, or loy that there isn't. So to it there's a wall even if there isn't, which means even though now there's not a wall, but there once was a wall, it's considered a walled city. So the second opinion is not the opinion of Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yossi, his brother Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yossi holds that as long as we know there's a tradition of a walled city, it's considered a walled city. Why? Because Eretz Yisrael was sanctified forever. That the first sanctification, that whatever is considered a city of Joshua's times, remains a city of Joshua's times as long as we know that it was a city. And therefore we had a question about the city of Tiberias, right? We don't know if Tiberias was a city or not. I just finished these 2 footnotes, and then we'll start next week with a discussion about Vahiv Me'achashverosh, back to the Megillah of is this good news or bad news? Okay. He was the 5th generation Tana, son of the Tana Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta. Rabbi Yossi had 5 sons, all ordained sages. The most famous among them was Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yossi, which we learned about just now. A disciple, colleague of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, means the last generation of the Tanoim, of the rabbis of the Mishnah. Apparently, Rabbi Lazar was significantly older than Rabbi Yossi was significantly older than his brother Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yossi was much older than his brother Rabbi Shmuel. Why? Because he was a colleague he participated in the delegation of sages to Rome with Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, which was way before the time of Rebbe. Not way before, but Rebbe was a student of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a contemporary of his father. In several places, the Gemara, there are exchanges between Rabbi Elazar and Reb Shimon with regard to halachic and agadic matters. During the visit to Rome, Rabbi Elazar was privileged to see the temple vessels among the emperor's treasures, and that's the whole question about the tzitz, the showplate, if it had 2 lines or 1 line, and the menorah, and he shared the details of what he saw with the sages. He traveled often and was an accomplished debater, etc. So he lived. Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Yossi were 2 brothers. One was older, obviously, than the next. Several halachic and agadic statements appeared throughout the Talmud. Okay, here he says the Rambam writes that the Brisa is not actually dealing with the sanctity of Jerusalem or Eretz Yisrael. The very existence of specific verse dealing with the status of walled cities indicates that this is a separate discussion. It means the Rambam writes that it's not necessarily proof about Eretz Yisrael. It could be just asking a question about walled cities. The statement is cited here only to indicate that Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Yossi, dealt with related issues, and it is conceivable that he was the Tana. He was the Tana of the one of the Brisa cited earlier. I mean to say, because we see that he discusses the issue, even though the issue is a separate issue, because walled cities is not the same discussion as the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. But we can assume that also discussed earlier about if the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael was sanctified in the way forever, and therefore the walled cities were also included in that. Okay, so basically, to just wrap this whole discussion up, is that the conclusion is that everyone agrees, seemingly from this Gemara, that Eretz Yisrael is a question whether it was sanctified, but it's clearly that Yerushalayim was a city that was sanctified forever, and therefore does not require sanctification. There still may be a question about if we have to have the walls of the temple for the Beis HaMikdash to be, for the Mizbeach to be a makom that you could sacrifice on. But nevertheless, Yerushalayim itself still remained the city, and therefore it was always forbidden to sacrifice outside of the Temple Mount. Until today, it seems like you can sacrifice on Temple Mount because the conventional wisdom, according to Rabbi Yeshua, is that you don't need the temple today to sacrifice. And if you don't need the temple, so therefore you could sacrifice on Temple Mount today. And therefore it's a question, when it comes Pesach, why are we not sacrificing the Korban Pesach? According to some people, they leave Jerusalem on Erev Pesach so that they shouldn't violate the requirement of sacrificing the Paschal Lamb today, when in theory we should be able to. Okay, I want to wish everyone a meaningful fast, and these discussions about the Beis HaMikdash should awaken a desire for the Beis HaMikdash. Eretz Hashem should be rebuilt the Karv in our time. Laila Tov, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.